Hi, everyone. My name is Mihailis Diamantis. I teach philosophy of law and corporate criminality at the University of Iowa College of Law. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about the fiction of corporate agency. I find it very odd to talk to an empty room, even an empty Zoom room. So please bear with me. I don't have any slides. I don't have a PowerPoint. Now, this paper about the fiction of corporate agency is about collectives generally, but I'll stick to talking about corporations throughout the paper because that's the type of group that I know the best. The thesis I'm advocating for is a linguistic thesis. It's about the meaning of sentences we use that predicate actions of corporations. One type of example, and a running example that I'll use throughout the talk, is that Apple bought stock in Macintosh. What I'll be arguing is that we should understand these sentences as being uttered in a fictional sense. They are part and parcel of a practical orientation towards corporations, according to which corporations are agents and are capable of doing things, but these sentences are, literally speaking, false. And in our soberer moments where we reflectively think about what corporations are, we know this to be true, know that these statements are in fact false. The motivation for this thesis is a dilemma that many of us experience. And if you don't feel any tension in this dilemma, then this paper isn't for you. If you deny either of its horns, this paper is not for you. You don't need fictionalism. You can turn this recording off now and hopefully just come and pepper me with questions during the Q&A. I will point out, though, that unless you're a philosopher, you're probably in the minority of people if you do not feel the force of this dilemma. Now, one horn of the dilemma is that we all talk about corporations as though they are agents capable of doing things. And it's not just we sometimes talk about corporations as though they do things. This is a pervasive feature of the way that we describe corporate activity out in the world. Headlines all over the place talk about BP spilling oil in the Gulf Coast, talk about Tesla producing cars, talk about Apple purchasing stock. And cognitive scientists have taken note. They've studied the psychological mechanisms that underlie this, what seems to be universal trait of how people talk about groups like corporations. Corporations, according to cognitive scientists, are what they call task groups, groups that have an organizing purpose and a hierarchical structure, in this case, the corporate hierarchy pursuing profit most typically. And task groups are a type of what cognitive scientists call entitative groups. Entitative groups are groups that we naturally represent in our cognition as entities, as agents. And we reason about them as though they're agents capable of doing and intending things. So that's the first horn of the dilemma. We talk about corporations as though they are agents and can do things. The second horn of the dilemma is one that I certainly feel, and a lot of people that I talk to when I teach my corporate crime class also feel, is a deep skepticism about whether corporations actually really are agents, whether they actually really have the moral or the tangible hardware to instantiate agency, to really do things in the ways that agents do them. When people walk along the halls of Apple HQ, they don't feel as though they're in the presence of an agent. If you ask an Apple employee whether they're part of some sort of hive agent, they'll just look at you puzzled. They'll probably think you're a philosopher. A lot of us have a hard time explaining why it makes sense to praise or blame BP or Tesla over and above just praising and blaming the individual employees of BP and Tesla. So that's the dilemma, that we talk about corporations as though they are agents, and yet a lot of us have deep skepticism about whether they actually could be agents. Now, if you feel the force of this dilemma, you're going to look for a way to reconcile its two horns. I've got a couple of approaches here. One that I'll describe and describe two variants of it before getting into my preferred approach, which is, as I've suggested already, fictionalism. So the first approach I'll discuss is what you might call linguistic individualism. I associate it with this philosopher, Anthony Quinton. According to linguistic individualisms, statements about corporations are actually statements about individuals within corporations. Pardon me. Let me step back. Statements about corporate actions are actually statements about actions taken by individuals within the corporation. You can think of statements predicating actions of corporations as just ways of summarizing more complex sentences about things individuals within the corporation, things that individuals within the corporation did. Now, if linguistic individualism is true, there's no dilemma. The dilemma has been resolved. The surface grammar of the things we say that corporations do is misleading. It doesn't actually commit us to a metaphysics of corporate agency because they're actually statements about individuals doing things, not about some separate entity over and above the individuals doing things. Now, ultimately, I think linguistic individualism is untenable, even though it could resolve the dilemma. To show why, we should distinguish two versions of linguistic individualism. The first is what I call simple linguistic individualism. According to simple linguistic individualism, when you say that a corporation did something, it means that some agents within the corporation did that exact same thing. So if you say that Apple bought stock, what that means is that there are individuals within Apple, individual employees who bought stock. And generally speaking, whenever you say that a corporation took some action phi, it means that there are some subset of people within that corporation who took that action phi. Now, initially, this sounds plausible. Just to take a real-life example, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau investigated Wells Fargo a couple of years ago, maybe 3, 4, when it was opening up all these fake accounts on behalf of customers. It was committing fraud against its customers. And the Consumer Cfpb, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's conclusion was, in its statement, that Wells Fargo opened unauthorized deposit and credit card accounts. Then we all know what this means. What it means is that individual employees at Wells Fargo open these fraudulent accounts. However, on further scrutiny, the simple linguistic individualism account falls. There are some actions that we predicate of corporations that we know are things the individuals within the corporation, no individual within the corporation could do. Sometimes we say that corporations do things that would be metaphysically impossible for individuals to do. So we might say a corporation or a group disbanded. Now, while a group can disband, individuals within the group can't themselves disband. Sometimes the things that we say corporations do are practically impossible for individuals within the group to do. We might say that 4 people have lifted a heavy wagon, and while they might collectively lift the heavy wagon, none of them individually might be capable of lifting the heavy wagon on their own. To give another real-life example that involves the CFPB and Wells Fargo, the CFPB ordered Wells Fargo to pay full restitution to all of its victims and to pay a $100 million fine. Clearly, the CFPB did not mean that any individual within Wells Fargo would pay the full amount of the fine. There might not be anyone within Wells Fargo who has sufficient money to pay the full fine. So simple linguistic individualism doesn't seem like it's going to get us very far. Now, another version of linguistic individualism is what I call sophisticated linguistic individualism. It abandons the requirement that when we say a corporation took some action, what we mean is that individuals took the exact same action within the corporation. More generally, what sophisticated linguistic individualism says is that when you say of some corporation that it did some action phi, you mean there are some members, M1, M2, M3, within the corporation that took some other actions, F1, Phi1, Phi2, Phi3, that amounted to the corporation phi. Now, this approach, sophisticated linguistic individualism, has a clear leg up over simple linguistic individualism. It can explain what we mean when we say a group disbanded. We don't mean that the individuals disbanded. We mean they each went their separate ways. That's something that individuals can do. When we say a group lifted a cart, we don't mean that any individual within the group lifted the cart. We mean they each lifted about 1/4 of the cart's entire weight and moved forward together. And sophisticated linguistic individualism, just like simple linguistic individualism, could resolve the dilemma. Just again, since the surface grammar of statements we make about corporations, groups like corporations, is misleading. We're actually still just talking about individuals, although the translation from what the corporation did to what we mean the individuals did might be a little more complicated. Now, once again, I think sophisticated linguistic individualism, like simple linguistic individualism, is unlikely to be true. And to explain why, I need to distinguish two things. One thing is what I mean when I utter a sentence about what a corporation has done. And the other is what I imply about a corporation when I say that it has done something. Let me take a non-corporate example to explain the distinction. Suppose I say a baseball player swung a bat. What I mean is that he gripped the bat in his hands and he moved it with his arms. That's what I mean when I say, that's what it means to say the baseball player swung a bat. But there are many other things that I might also imply, that I do indeed imply when I say the baseball player swung the bat. I imply that certain neurons were firing inside of him. Of course I have to imply that because human arms only move when neurons are firing. And I also imply that there was some micro movements of the air about him because, of course, objects in motion in air disturb the air about them. But I don't mean these things about neurons or air. I wasn't thinking about them when I uttered the sentence that the baseball player swung the bat. And even if I was thinking about them, I probably lack the biological and physical knowledge to really mean anything really tangible about neurons and air currents. What I do mean, and what I do imply, this is now to take us back to the corporate example. So to take us back to the corporate example, what do I mean and what do I imply when I say something complex like a corporation did something, such as that Apple bought stock in Macintosh? Now, one thing I imply, and I certainly imply this, is that different employees took different steps that amounted to a stock purchase. After all, I know that's how corporations do anything. Anything that happens within a corporation is something that the employees do. But I don't likely mean anything specific about what individual employees did. Unless I know a lot about corporations and finance, I probably have very little idea. In fact, I will confess to you, I have no idea what steps individuals within a corporation could take to effectuate a corporate stock purchase. And even if I did know, unless I worked at Apple, I probably have no idea specifically what happened in Apple that would amount to a corporate stock purchase. So this, I think, puts a lot of pressure on sophisticated linguistic individualism. It seems that it requires us, when we make statements about groups like corporations, to mean something about what individual employees did, something that we really can't know anything about. So I've now cleared the stage. We have this dilemma, the dilemma being that we have a way of speaking about corporations that suggests that they are agents, where the surface grammar seems to suggest they are agents capable of doing things, but we don't really want to subscribe on to the metaphysical commitments of corporate agency. I've talked about linguistic individualism, both the simple and the sophisticated versions, and shown why they don't seem to be a plausible route for resolving the dilemma. So this, I think, sets the stage for now exploring another approach, my preferred approach, which is fictionalism. Here, before describing what a philosophical position in fictionalism might look like, it bears noting that there's some solid precedent for fictionalism. A similar sort of dilemma between the way we talk about corporations, the way we actually think about corporations, their metaphysics, exists in the law. The law routinely, legal actors talk about corporations as though they are agents. They can break laws and be prosecuted for crimes or pursued for torts they've committed. They can purchase stocks. They can do things in the real world. The law speaks about corporations as though they do these things. However, there's a long history of deep skepticism in the law and among legal actors about whether corporations really are agents, and this skepticism has existed since the beginning of corporate history. Lord Chancellor Edward Thurlow in the 18th century very famously said, "Corporations have neither bodies to be punished nor souls to be condemned. They therefore do as they like." And that skepticism exists even today when we talk about corporations in the law. The solution the law hit on was fictionalism, very explicitly a fictionalist stance towards corporate agency. To quote one Supreme Court opinion, American Supreme Court opinion, "The corporate personality is a fiction, although a fiction intended to be acted upon as though it were a fact." So now let me turn to the view that I'm espousing here, fictionalism as a philosophical view about what statements concerning corporate action mean. Now, the first thing I have to say is we'll just give a meaning account. So if our statements about corporate action don't mean what the linguistic individualists say, what do they mean? And here I propose taking a very naive approach. The problem with individualism was that I think it tried to cross levels of explanation. It tried to recount what corporations are doing, a description at the entity level, in terms of what individuals are doing, a description at the individual level. And without a doubt, as I've said, we do imply many things about what individuals within corporations do when we make statements about corporations doing things. However, as I've suggested, I don't think we mean any of those things because there's just epistemic limitations on what we could possibly mean, given that we don't, most of us, know much about how corporations operate or know about how specific corporations operate, and yet nonetheless utter statements about what corporations have done very routinely. What I think instead statements about corporate action mean is the meaning should be cashed out solely in terms of corporate level phenomena. That verbs predicated of corporations have the exact same meaning as when they are predicated of individuals. So if I say Bob bought stock, what I mean to say that, well, Bob paid some money and received some stock in return. I don't mean anything precise about how it came about the biomechanical or biochemical mechanisms that were involved in his purchasing the stock. All I mean by Bob purchased stock are phenomena that are explained at the Bob level of explanation, that he paid money and received stock in return. Similarly, when I say that Apple bought stock, what I mean is that, well, Apple paid money and received stock in return. I don't mean anything precise about how it came about that Apple purchased stock, about what its employees did. Now, I think fictionalism can help us resolve this conflict between our linguistic practice and our metaphysical commitments, because according to fictionalism, although these statements seem to reify corporate agency, the things that corporations do, they are uttered only in a fictional sense. They are true only within a fictional mode in which corporations are agents and can do things, but literally speaking, those statements are false. And those of us who are skeptics about corporate agency know them to be false, or at least think we know them to be false. Now, the final piece of just describing and setting up this fictionalist position is to explain why people like me who are skeptical about the metaphysics of corporate agency might nonetheless engage in this discourse, which it seems to attribute agency to corporations, seems to describe corporations as doing things. And there are two reasons why. One might be, and some cognitive scientists have suggested this, that viewing corporations as agents may be hardwired to us. We might be, the fictional mode might in a sense be inescapable for us, just like a visual illusion is inescapable for us. We see the Mueller-Lyer lines, we know that they are the same length, and yet we can't trick our eyes into seeing that they're the same length. We're in the grips of the visual fiction according to which they are different lengths, yet we know in reflective fact that they are in fact the same length. That's one sort of explanation about why we may nonetheless engage in this fictional discourse. Another explanation is, well, it's very useful to pretend that corporations can do things. The history of modern economic advancement traces alongside advancement in corporate technology and corporate history. And in order for corporations to contribute to this growth in social welfare that economic advancement allows, they have to be able to do the sorts of things that corporations do, to produce things, to own stock, and the like. Now, here I've just sort of set out the position of fictionalism. I haven't given a full justification for it, but I hope I've given some hope to those of us who find ourselves at this dilemma's crossroads between what our language says and what our metaphysical commitments are, that maybe fictionalism is a worthwhile position to explore. Thank you very much, and I look forward to talking to you guys when my session comes up.